For decades, scientists believed they knew what happens to the brain when the heart stops. The story seems straightforward. The heart ceases to beat, blood flow halts, oxygen no longer reaches the brain, electrical activity fades, and death follows. It was tidy, it was orderly, it was final. But recent research tells a radically different story. The human brain does not simply shut down in those last moments, it surges. In 2023, researchers recorded something astonishing in dying humans: gamma oscillations. The fastest brain waves our brains produce, the ones most closely linked to conscious thought, spiked to levels 5 to 8 times stronger than anything seen during normal waking life. Far from going silent, the brain's final act is a surge of unparalleled electrical activity. To understand why, we need to step into the mind of a pioneering neuroscientist, Dr. Jimo Borjigin. For years, she studied how the brain regulates hormones and circadian rhythms, the chemistry that tells us when to be awake, when to sleep, why noon feels alert and midnight makes us drowsy. Her work had nothing to do with death. Yet, repeatedly, a strange signal kept appearing in her data. During experiments with animals, some of which died unexpectedly, or as part of unrelated studies, her instruments occasionally captured unusual electrical signatures at the moment of death. Neurons weren't shutting down as expected. They were firing, organized, coherent activity. Most scientists would have ignored it. It wasn't what they were looking for. Borjigin did not look away. In 2013, she designed a study specifically to explore what happens in the brain as life ends. She attached high-density EEG arrays to 9 rats, monitoring every electrode, tracking every frequency band, observing their brains continuously before, during, and after cardiac arrest. She wanted to see the dying brain unfiltered by assumptions. What she saw in the 30 seconds after the heart stopped defied expectations. Instead of fading into silence, the rats' brains surged. Gamma oscillations, cycling between 30 and 100 Hz, spiked sharply. This was not random noise or a chaotic firing of neurons. It was coherent, synchronized activity across multiple brain regions. Patterns neuroscience typically associates with conscious processing. The dying brains were electrically more active than they had been at any moment while alive. 5 to 8 times more active. The findings were published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the reaction from the neuroscience community was immediate and divided. No one disputed the measurements. The data were meticulous. Every rat showed the same pattern. The gamma surge appeared within half a minute of cardiac arrest, concentrated in cortical regions. What people questioned was interpretation. Rats are not humans. A rodent brain under anesthesia, dying under lab conditions, may not reflect the experience of a human brain succumbing to heart failure, stroke, or age. Critics suggested a simpler explanation. Perhaps it was a final, random electrical spasm, the dying gasp of a machine losing power. Borjigin argued that the coherence and frequency patterns suggested otherwise. The brains weren't simply breaking down, they were producing organized activity in the final moments. The next decade of her life was spent asking the most crucial question: does this happen in humans? Studying death in humans presents obvious ethical challenges. You cannot induce cardiac arrest for research. Borjigin needed patients whose families had already consented to end life support. Years of careful collaboration with intensive care teams eventually made this possible. 4 patients, all on life support with no prospect of recovery, agreed to participate. High-density EEG electrodes were placed on their skulls, mirroring the rat experiments. As the ventilators were turned off and the hearts slowed, 2 of the 4 patients displayed the extraordinary pattern Borjigin had predicted. Even after the heart had stopped, after blood ceased to reach the brain, organized gamma oscillations appeared. Not scattered noise, but coherent activity concentrated in the temporal, parietal, occipital junction, the posterior cortical, hot zone. This is significant. Decades of research by scientists like Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch have mapped consciousness in the human brain. The posterior hot zone integrates visual information, spatial awareness, bodily sensations, and memory. It's the part of the brain that generates the unified sense of being, what makes you you. Damage here can erase consciousness, even if the rest of the brain remains intact. Stimulation can produce vivid perceptual experiences, even under anesthesia. In the dying patients, this region was firing at levels exceeding normal waking consciousness. For 2 to 5 minutes after the heart stopped, the same region that sustains conscious experience surged with intensity unmatched in the patient's lives. Why does this happen? The answer lies in the fundamental biology of neurons. Every neuron maintains a tiny voltage difference across its membrane, roughly 70 millivolts inside relative to outside. This small charge underpins everything: thought, sensation, memory, consciousness. Maintaining it consumes enormous energy. A single molecular machine, the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, maintains this gradient. Constantly, tirelessly, it pushes sodium out and pulls potassium in, burning ATP, the cell's energy currency. This task consumes about 40% of the brain's total energy, which in turn accounts for nearly half of the body's oxygen used by the brain. It's astonishingly expensive, a single purpose sustaining the very fabric of thought. When the heart stops, oxygen supply ceases. The pumps don't fail immediately. The brain has a small reserve, about 20 seconds of stored oxygen in blood vessels and glycogen in support cells. For those precious seconds, neurons continue to function, maintaining the voltage gradient, sustaining consciousness, running on fumes. Then the ATP runs out. The pumps stop. Voltage gradients collapse. Neurons lose their charge. This triggers spreading depolarization, sometimes called a brain tsunami. The collapse propagates slowly across the cortex like a rolling blackout. Sodium rushes in, potassium flows out, and every neuron loses its delicate balance. But this collapse is paradoxically active. As each neuron depolarizes, it fires one last time, or a rapid series of times, before silence. Multiply this by billions of neurons, and the spreading wave becomes a surge of electrical activity. Gamma frequency oscillations appear, coherent, concentrated in the posterior hot zone, the region tied to consciousness. The brain, even in death, briefly achieves its most intense coordinated activity ever. Chemistry compounds the phenomenon. As neurons depolarize, they dump neurotransmitters en masse, glutamate, serotonin, and more, into the brain's extracellular space. Glutamate excites neighboring neurons, spreading the wave. Serotonin, critical for perception and mood, floods the brain, activating 5-HT2A receptors, the same receptors targeted by potent psychedelics. The result in living brains is a radical shift in perception, dissolution of self, a sense of encountering something greater, often described in near-death experiences. Some researchers even propose that the brain produces endogenous molecules like DMT, naturally occurring psychedelics, at death. While unmeasured in humans, evidence in rats suggests this is plausible. Regardless, the serotonin surge alone is sufficient to saturate receptors, creating conditions that pharmacology shows can produce profound alterations in consciousness. The question remains, do dying humans experience anything? Decades of studies provide intriguing hints. Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, systematically interviewed 344 cardiac arrest survivors. About 18% described conscious experiences, while clinically dead moving through a dark space toward light, panoramic life reviews, encounters with deceased loved ones. The experiences were peaceful, structured, coherent, and vivid. Not the fragmented hallucinations typical of oxygen-deprived brains, but orderly, meaningful events. Lifelong atheists reported the same as lifelong believers. Later studies such as AWAR2 published in 2023 confirmed that some survivors recalled specific auditory and visual details from the period of cardiac arrest that were independently verifiable. Nurses' words, equipment sounds, CPR sequences. These memories occurred when EEG monitoring showed no cortical activity, when the heart had stopped. The dying brain was not asleep. Something was happening. The gamma surge Borjigin observed provides a potential mechanism. The neurotransmitter flood offers a trigger. Near-death experiences describe the phenomenology. None of these individually prove consciousness after death. Together, they describe a window where the brain defies our assumptions, producing the most intense, organized, chemically and electrically saturated activity it has ever generated in the very region tied to conscious experience. Textbooks describe death as orderly, final, silent. The data tells a different story. In the final minutes, the brain doesn't fade, it erupts. Electrical activity surges. Neurotransmitters flood consciousness. Altering chemistry saturates critical receptors, and the posterior cortical hot zone fires more intensely than ever before. Life and death are not separated by a hard line. They exist along a gradient. Somewhere in that gradient, your brain performs its final act, a storm of electrical and chemical activity that 86 billion neurons have spent your lifetime preparing for. Whether anyone experiences it remains unknown. But for a brief window, the brain defies silence, exploding with the power of consciousness one last time. 70 millivolts is the resting charge of a human neuron, the foundation of thought, sensation, memory, and consciousness. 0 millivolts is the state of depolarization, as the neuron collapses in the spreading wave of death. Between these numbers lies the entire experience of being alive. Every thought you have had, every memory recalled, every moment that mattered exists in this 70 millivolt window. When the pump stops, that window closes. For 2 to 5 minutes, or perhaps less, depending on oxygen reserves, the brain may briefly fire at its maximum potential, a final crescendo of consciousness before silence. The instruments measure voltage. They cannot measure what it is like to be inside it. They cannot know if, in those last moments, a person experiences a final scene of their life, a vision of light, or the profound peace described by survivors. Physics and neuroscience can describe the storm. They cannot tell us whether anyone witnesses it. And yet, the data is unmistakable. The brain does not die quietly. It produces, in its final moments, a surge of electrical and chemical activity concentrated precisely where consciousness resides, in the region that generates the sense of self. Whether anyone experiences it is unknown. But the brain's last act, unlike textbooks and assumptions, is not silence. It is an eruption, a final, organized, magnificent crescendo of life.